The massive Voth spacecraft materializes over New York City, its shadow engulfing the metropolis in an instant. Skyscrapers vanish beneath its bulk as crowds gather in the streets, faces turn skyward in awe and terror. Prince Zorn, heir to the Voth throne, emerges from the craft in a shimmer of advanced technology. His reptilian features twist into what passes for a smile among his species as he surveys the sea of humans below. Hours later, Prince Zorn stands before the United Nations General Assembly. His voice, amplified and translated, echoes through the chamber. People of Earth, we come seeking a tribute, 1,000 young human females to serve as pets for our noble houses. Comply or face annihilation. Gasps and murmurs ripple through the assembly. The Secretary General's face pales as he grasps the implications. In the gallery, diplomats exchange worried glances, their smartphones buzzing with urgent messages from world leaders. At the Pentagon, Mark Ross strides into a top-secret briefing room. The 28-year-old former Navy SEAL, now a CIA operative, nods to the grim-faced military brass gathered around a holographic display of the Voth ship. "Ross, we need you on a covert mission," General Hawkins says, cutting straight to the point. "Infiltrate that ship. Find their weaknesses. We're sending a delegation under the guise of negotiations. You'll be part of it." Mark's jaw clenches as he absorbs the information. Then his phone vibrates, a text from his mother. "They've taken Emily. His sister's name is on the list of potential pets." "I'm in," Mark says, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "When do we leave?" As preparations begin, Uma, a lower-ranking Voth female, watches from the shadows of the ship's docking bay. Her scales shimmer with an iridescent sheen as she observes the incoming human delegation. Her eyes lock onto Mark, noting his muscular frame and alert posture. Something about him intrigues her, sparking a feeling she can't quite name. Mark steps onto the alien vessel, his senses on high alert. The air carries a faint, unfamiliar scent. Strange symbols line the walls, pulsing with an inner light. As he follows the Voth guide deeper into the ship, he catches glimpses of laboratories and holding cells. In one, he sees human women strapped to examination tables, surrounded by complex machinery. The sight confirms his worst fears. This isn't about pets. It's about genetic experimentation, forced breeding, and who knows what other horrors. Mark's mind races, formulating plans. He needs to find Emily, sabotage the Voth's operation, and somehow turn the tables on these alien invaders. As Mark rounds a corner, he comes face to face with Uma. Their eyes meet, and for a moment, neither moves. In that instant, Mark senses a potential ally. But can he trust her? And will it be enough to save humanity from the Voth's sinister plans? With the fate of Earth hanging in the balance, Mark takes a deep breath and prepares for the fight of his life. The clock is ticking, and the true battle is about to begin. Mark's eyes lingered on Uma for a moment longer, assessing the potential ally before him. The Voth female's iridescent scales shimmered under the ship's ambient lighting, her expression inscrutable. Mark took a calculated risk. "I seem to have lost my way," he said, feigning confusion. "Could you assist me?" Uma's reptilian features shifted into what Mark interpreted as curiosity. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying an unexpected melodic quality. "I am Uma. I will be your guide during your stay aboard our vessel." As they walked through the labyrinthine corridors, Mark's trained eye absorbed every detail. He noted the placement of security cameras, the patterns of guard rotations, and the layout of critical systems. Uma, whether by accident or design, proved to be a wealth of information. "The human females are being processed in the lower levels," she mentioned casually, gesturing towards a heavily guarded elevator. "Prince Zorn is most eager to begin the integration process." Mark's expression resolute imperceptibly. "Integration process?" he prompted, maintaining his diplomatic facade. Uma hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Our species faces a grave threat. Centuries of selective breeding among our nobility have led to genetic stagnation. We need fresh genetic material to ensure our survival." The implications hit Mark like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about pets. It was about breeding stock. He thought of Emily and the other women, imagining them subjected to alien experimentation. His purpose hardened. As they continued their tour, Mark found himself drawn into conversation with Uma. Her perspective on Voth culture and the current crisis was fascinating, and he sensed a complexity to her character that belied her subservient role. Their rapport was interrupted by a shipwide announcement. Prince Zorn's voice boomed through hidden speakers. "The time for diplomacy has passed. Begin the collection process immediately." Alarms blared, and the ship hummed with increased activity. Mark's heart raced as he realized the Voth were launching a full-scale abduction of human women from Earth's surface. "I need to contact my superiors," Mark said urgently, turning to Uma. "Can you show me to a communication station?" Uma's eyes darted nervously. "Follow me," she said, leading him down a less-traveled corridor. Instead of a comm station, Mark found himself in a small, private chamber. Uma sealed the door behind them. "You are not who you claim to be," she stated, her gaze piercing. "Who are you really, and what is your purpose here?" Mark weighed his options quickly. The mission parameters had changed drastically, and he needed an inside advantage. Taking a deep breath, he decided to gamble on the connection he'd sensed with Uma. "My name is Mark Ross," he admitted. "I'm here to gather intelligence and protect my people, including my sister, who's been taken by your kind." Uma's eyes widened, but she didn't call for guards. "I suspected as much," she said softly. "Your concern for the human females was too personal to be merely diplomatic." "Will you help me?" Mark asked, his voice low and intense. "What Prince Zorn is doing is wrong. There has to be another way." Uma's internal struggle played out across her features. Finally, she nodded. "I will help you. The lower levels are this way." As they navigated through restricted areas of the ship, Mark and Uma encountered horrifying sights. In one laboratory, unconscious women lay connected to bizarre machinery, their bodies being systematically analyzed and cataloged. "Emily," Mark breathed, spotting his sister among the captives. With Uma's help, he managed to override the security protocols and free Emily along with several other women. "Hide here," Mark instructed the group, guiding them to a rarely used storage compartment Uma had identified. "I'll come back for you when it's safe." No sooner had they secured the freed captives than alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Prince Zorn's voice rang out once more. "Intruder alert. All security forces, initiate full lockdown procedures." "This way," Uma hissed, pulling Mark into a narrow service tunnel. They emerged in a different section of the ship, but the sound of approaching guards forced them to seek refuge in Uma's private quarters. As the door slid shut behind them, Mark and Uma found themselves alone in the intimate space. The tension that had been building between them, a mixture of adrenaline, mutual attraction, and the weight of their shared secret, suddenly became palpable. Uma stepped closer, her alien features softening as she studied Mark's face. "Your species is so different from ours," she murmured, reaching out to trace the contours of his jaw. "And yet, I find myself drawn to you in ways I cannot explain." Mark caught her hand, marveling at the texture of her scales against his skin. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice husky. Their lips met in a kiss that bridged the gap between their species. It was electric, passionate, and charged with the forbidden nature of their attraction. As they sank onto Uma's sleeping platform, their bodies entwining, Mark knew that this wasn't just physical release. It was a profound connection that could change everything. In the aftermath of their lovemaking, as they lay intertwined, Uma's scales cool against Mark's flushed skin, reality came crashing back. The ship's alarms, which had faded into background noise, suddenly seemed to increase in volume and urgency. "We need to move," Mark said, reluctantly disentangling himself from Uma's embrace. "Prince Zorn won't stop until he finds us." Uma nodded, her eyes filled with a new grit. "I know a way to the ship's central control room. If we can access it, we might be able to stop the abductions and free the remaining captives." As they hurriedly dressed and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, Mark caught Uma's gaze. In that moment, he saw not just an alien ally, but a partner who shared his vision for a different future, one where their peoples could coexist and thrive together. With a shared nod of understanding, Mark and Uma slipped out of the room and into the chaotic corridors of the Voth ship, ready to fight for the fate of both their species. With a shared nod of understanding, Mark and Uma slipped out of the room and into the chaotic corridors of the Voth ship, ready to fight for the fate of both their species. The blaring alarms echoed through the metal passageways, creating a cacophony that masked their hurried footsteps. "We need to split up," Mark whispered, his breath hot against Uma's ear scales. "I'll get Emily and the others. You head for the control center." Uma's eyes locked onto Mark's, conveying a mix of perseverance and concern. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely audible above the din. "I'll disable the security systems and create a diversion." They parted ways at the next junction, Mark's heart pounding as he watched Uma's lithe form disappear around a corner. Pushing aside his worry for her safety, he focused on the task at hand. His Navy SEAL training kicked in as he moved silently through the ship's corridors, avoiding the increasing number of Voth patrols. As Mark approached the storage area where Emily and the other freed women were hiding, he heard the unmistakable sound of Prince Zorn's voice echoing through the ship's communication system. "Attention, all personnel," the prince's guttural tones resonated. "We have intruders aboard. Find them immediately. Commander Krell, interrogate all lower-ranking staff who've had contact with the humans." Mark's heart made. The situation was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. He quickened his pace, reaching the storage compartment in a matter of minutes. As the door slid open, he was met with a sea of terrified faces. "Mark!" Emily's voice broke through the frightened murmurs. She rushed to embrace her brother, her body trembling. "We need to move now," Mark said, addressing the group. "I'm getting you all out of here." He led the women through the ship's winding passages, constantly alert for any sign of Voth guards. Their progress was painfully slow, each step fraught with tension. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps forced them to seek shelter in a narrow maintenance shaft. Meanwhile, Uma had reached the control center. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. As she entered, the Voth technicians inside looked up in surprise. "What are you doing here?" one of them demanded. Uma didn't respond. Instead, she launched herself at the nearest technician, her powerful legs propelling her across the room. The element of surprise gave her the advantage, and she quickly subdued the first two Voth. The third, however, put up a fierce fight. They grappled on the floor, Uma's superior strength gradually overpowering her opponent. With a final, decisive move, she pinned the technician down, rendering him unconscious. Panting heavily, Uma pulled herself up and approached the main control panel. Her fingers flew across the alien symbols, initiating a cascading power failure throughout non-essential areas of the ship. Lights flickered and died, security doors malfunctioned, and chaos erupted among the Voth crew. Taking advantage of the darkness and confusion, Mark guided the human women through the ship's now treacherous corridors. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of lower-ranking Voth females. Mark tensed, ready for a fight, but to his surprise, one of the Voth stepped forward with open palms. "We want to help," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I am Lyra. We no longer support our leadership's actions." Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We're heading for the escape pods. Can you lead us there?" Lyra agreed, and the now expanded group continued their journey through the ship. As they moved, Mark noticed they were passing through an area with more advanced-looking technology. His instincts told him this could be valuable. "Wait," he whispered, pulling out his diplomatic badge. He activated the hidden camera and began documenting the room's contents. The information could be crucial for Earth's defense and future negotiations. Suddenly, the ship lurched beneath their feet. Prince Zorn's voice once again filled the air. "Prepare for light-speed travel. We're leaving Earth's orbit." Mark's blood ran cold. They were out of time. "The escape pod bay is just ahead," Lyra announced, pointing down a long corridor. As they raced towards their destination, Mark's thoughts turned to Uma. Where was she? Had she been captured? The group reached the escape pod bay, but Uma was nowhere in sight. "Emily," Mark said, turning to his sister, "I need you and Lyra to lead everyone out. I have to find Uma." Emily's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, understanding the commitment in her brother's gaze. As Mark watched the escape pods launch, Carrying the human women and Voth defectors to safety, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The hardest part of his mission was still ahead. Turning away from the empty bay, Mark set off into the depths of the Voth ship. He moved with renewed purpose, every sense alert for signs of Uma or potential threats. The fate of two worlds now rested on their shoulders, and Mark was determined to see their mission through to the end. The fate of two worlds now rested on their shoulders, and Mark was determined to see their mission through to the very end. As Mark navigated the dimly lit corridors, his thoughts raced. He needed to find Uma and formulate a plan to stop Prince Zorn's invasion once and for all. The ship's alarms continued to blare, creating a disorienting cacophony that echoed through the metal passageways. Suddenly, Mark caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette rounding a corner. "Uma!" he called out, his voice barely audible above the din. Uma turned, her eyes widening with relief as she saw Mark. They rushed towards each other, meeting in a brief but intense embrace. "I was worried," Mark admitted, his hands still resting on Uma's shoulders. "No time for that," Uma replied, her voice urgent. "I've disabled some of the ship's systems, but we need to do more. I have an idea." Uma quickly outlined her plan to target the ship's central power core. Mark nodded, his military training already kicking in as he considered the tactical implications. "It's risky, but it might be our best shot," he agreed. "Lead the way." As they made their way through the labyrinthine corridors, they encountered pockets of resistance from loyal Voth guards. Mark's combat experience proved invaluable as they engaged in a series of skirmishes. During one particularly intense firefight, Mark found himself pinned down behind a bulkhead, Voth energy weapons sizzling past his head. He glanced at Uma, who was crouched behind a nearby console, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and perseverance. "Uma, on my mark, provide covering fire," Mark shouted. Uma nodded, her grip tightening on the unfamiliar weapon she had acquired. Mark counted down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. "Now!" he yelled, springing from his position. Uma unleashed a barrage of energy bolts, forcing the Voth guards to take cover. Mark used the distraction to close the distance, his movements fluid and precise. In a flurry of hand-to-hand combat, he disarmed and incapacitated two guards before they could react. Uma watched in awe as Mark moved with lethal efficiency. Something stirred within her, a primal recognition of his skill and bravery. As the last guard fell, she found herself moving without conscious thought, her body flowing into combat stances she never knew she possessed. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Mark asked, breathing heavily as the skirmish ended. Uma looked at her hands in wonder. I don't know. It just happened." Their eyes met, a new level of understanding passing between them. Their bond was growing stronger with each shared danger, each moment of teamwork. As they continued their journey towards the power core, they encountered less resistance. Word of Uma's defection had spread, and many lower-ranking Voth were beginning to question their loyalties. Finally, they reached the entrance to the power core chamber. The massive doors loomed before them, humming with energy. Mark placed his hand on the cool metal surface, feeling the vibrations of the ship's heart beyond. "This is it," he said, turning to Uma. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Uma nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm ready." Mark input the override codes Uma had provided, and the doors slowly parted. As they stepped into the cavernous chamber, their momentary sense of triumph evaporated. The power core pulsed with otherworldly energy at the center of the room, but surrounding it was a squad of elite Voth soldiers. At their head stood an imposing figure, his armor more ornate than the others. "Welcome, traitors," the Voth commander's voice boomed across the chamber. "I am Captain Vex, and this is as far as you go." Mark and Uma exchanged a glance, sizing up their opponents. The odds were heavily stacked against them, but they had come too far to turn back now. "Any ideas?" Mark whispered, his mind already racing through potential strategies. Uma's eyes darted around the room, taking in the layout and the positions of the Voth soldiers. "We need to get to those control panels," she murmured, indicating a bank of consoles near the power core. "If we can overload the system, it might give us the edge we need." Mark nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "All right, here's what we'll do." Before he could finish, Captain Vex raised his weapon. Enough talk. Surrender now or face the consequences of your treason. Mark and Uma stood their ground, tension crackling in the air like electricity. The fate of two worlds hung in the balance as they prepared to face their greatest challenge yet. Mark and Uma stood their ground, tension crackling in the air as they faced Captain Vex and his elite squad. The power core pulsed behind them, its otherworldly energy casting an eerie glow across the chamber. Before either side could make a move, a violent tremor rocked the ship. The lights flickered, and alarms blared with renewed intensity. A sudden surge of energy coursed through the vessel, causing consoles to spark and systems to malfunction. "What's happening?" Mark shouted over the cacophony. Uma's eyes widened as she analyzed the readings on a nearby display. The power core is destabilizing. It's causing a cascade failure throughout the ship's systems. As if on cue, massive blast doors began slamming shut, sealing off various sections of the ship. Mark watched in horror as a thick metal barrier descended between him and Uma, cutting off their escape route. "Uma!" he called out, pressing his hand against the cold surface of the blast door. "I'm all right," her muffled voice came through, "but we're separated. We need to find another way to the bridge." Captain Vex's laughter echoed through the chamber. "You've sealed your own fate, traitors. This ship will be your tomb." Mark's mind raced, assessing their options. "Uma, can you hear me? We need to regroup. Let's meet at the secondary entrance to the bridge." "Understood," Uma replied. "Be careful, Mark. I'll see you there." With a final glance at the sealed blast door, Mark turned to face Captain Vex and his squad. The Voth commander raised his weapon, but another violent tremor threw off his aim. Using the distraction to his advantage, Mark dove behind a nearby console. Energy bolts sizzled past him as he crawled towards a maintenance hatch he'd spotted earlier. With a grunt of effort, he wrenched it open and slipped inside, the sounds of battle fading as he entered the ship's internal network of tunnels and shafts. The maintenance tunnels were a maze of narrow passages and junction points. Mark moved swiftly, his Navy SEAL training kicking in as he navigated the claustrophobic space. The ship continued to shudder and groan around him, systems failing in cascading waves. As he rounded a corner, Mark came face to face with a group of confused Voth crew members. They reached for their weapons, but Mark was faster. With precise, controlled movements, he disarmed the first Voth, using the alien's momentum to throw him into his companions. The confined space worked to Mark's advantage as he engaged the remaining crew. He struck with surgical precision, targeting pressure points and weak spots in the Voth anatomy that Uma had taught him. Within moments, the Voth lay unconscious at his feet. Mark paused to catch his breath, his heart pounding. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern for Uma. Was she facing similar challenges? He pushed the thought aside, knowing he needed to stay focused on the mission. Meanwhile, Uma was taking a more direct route to the bridge. Her intimate knowledge of Voth ship design allowed her to bypass security checkpoints and navigate around disabled elevators. She moved with purpose, her lithe form slipping through narrow gaps and scaling access ladders with ease. As Uma approached a major junction, she heard the telltale sound of a patrol approaching. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as a group of armed Voth guards passed by. Their conversation drifted to her ears. "The humans have launched an attack on our external weapon systems," one guard said, his voice tinged with fear. "The ship's taken heavy damage." Uma's heart raced at the news. Earth's military was providing an unexpected distraction, but it also meant time was running out. She needed to reach the bridge before the situation escalated further. With renewed urgency, Uma continued her journey. She encountered pockets of resistance along the way, but her newfound combat skills allowed her to dispatch them quickly and efficiently. Each confrontation left her more determined, her movements becoming more fluid and instinctive. As Mark and Uma made their separate ways towards the bridge, Prince Zorn paced frantically on the command deck. Reports of system failures and external attacks flooded in from all corners of the ship. "This cannot be happening," Zorn snarled, his composure cracking under the pressure. He turned to Captain Vex, who had just arrived from the power core chamber. "Prepare the gravitational singularity device. If we can't have Earth, no one will." Captain Vex's eyes widened. "But Your Highness, the device is untested. We don't know if we can control it. Do it, Zorn roared, spit flying from his mouth. I want that device operational now. As the Voth crew scrambled to comply with their prince's orders, Mark finally reached the secondary entrance to the bridge. He pressed himself against the wall, catching his breath and assessing the situation. To his surprise, he found himself face to face with a group of young Voth females, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Please, one of them said, stepping forward. We don't want any part of this conflict. We're scientists, not soldiers. Mark lowered his weapon, sensing an opportunity. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm trying to stop this madness and find a peaceful solution. The lead scientist, her scales a pale blue, nodded slowly. We've been working on an alternative solution to our genetic crisis, one that doesn't involve exploiting humans. But Prince Zorn wouldn't listen. A plan began to form in Mark's mind. Can you help me access the bridge's systems from here? We might be able to end this without further bloodshed. As the scientists began to work on bypassing the bridge's security protocols, Mark heard a commotion from down the corridor. He turned to see Uma approaching, her body battered, but her eyes burning with grit. Uma! He called out, relief flooding through him. She stumbled towards him, favoring her left leg. Mark rushed to meet her, supporting her weight as she reached him. I'm all right, she said through gritted teeth. Just a few scrapes along the way. Mark's protective instincts flared as he examined her injuries. A deep gash ran along her right arm, and bruises were beginning to form on her exposed scales. With gentle hands, he began to tend to her wounds, using supplies from a med kit he'd picked up along the way. As he worked, their eyes met, and a moment of profound connection passed between them. In the midst of chaos and danger, they found a moment of quiet intimacy. Uma placed her hand over Mark's, her touch sending a shiver through him. We're going to make it through this, Mark said softly, his voice filled with a conviction he hadn't felt before. Together. Uma nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of emotions. Together, she echoed. Their moment was interrupted by one of the Voth scientists. We've done it! We have access to the bridge's systems. Mark and Uma shared a determined look. It was time to end this, once and for all. They turned towards the bridge entrance, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fate of two worlds rested on their shoulders, and they were prepared to see it through to the end. As Mark and Uma turned towards the bridge entrance, the ship lurched violently, throwing them off balance. Alarms blared with renewed urgency, and the deck beneath their feet trembled. We're entering Earth's atmosphere, Uma shouted, her eyes wide with realization. Mark's training kicked in as he assessed the situation. We need to get to the helm. Now! They burst onto the bridge, finding it in chaos. Voth crew members scrambled to maintain control of the rapidly descending vessel, but the compromised systems and failing power core made their efforts futile. Move, Mark commanded, pushing his way to the pilot's seat. Uma followed close behind, her hands flying over the unfamiliar controls. The view screen showed the blue-green curve of Earth growing larger by the second. Mark's hands gripped the controls, his eyes hardened in concentration. Uma, I need you to be my eyes and ears. Tell me everything you can about this ship's landing capabilities. Uma nodded, her fingers dancing across the alien interface. The anti-gravity systems are offline. We're essentially flying a brick with wings. But if we can reroute power from non-essential systems, we might be able to control our descent. Mark's mind raced, drawing on every bit of flight training he'd ever received. Do it, and give me everything you've got on the maneuvering thrusters. As Uma worked feverishly to give Mark the control he needed, the ship plummeted through the atmosphere. The hull groaned under the strain, and the bridge filled with the acrid smell of burning circuitry. We're coming in too hot, Uma yelled, her voice strained. Mark's hands moved with precision, coaxing every ounce of responsiveness from the failing ship. I see a clearing. Looks like desert. We're going to have to bring her down there. The Mojave Desert stretched out before them, a vast expanse of sand and rock. Mark aimed for the flattest area he could find, knowing they'd need every bit of space to slow their momentum. Brace for impact, Mark shouted as the ground rushed up to meet them. The ship slammed into the desert floor with a deafening roar. Metal screamed as the hull tore along the ground, leaving a deep furrow in its wake. Mark and Uma were thrown against their restraints, the violent shaking threatening to tear them from their seats. For what seemed like an eternity, the world was nothing but noise and motion. Then, with a final, shuddering groan, the ship came to rest. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of ruptured pipes and the distant sound of alarms. Mark blinked, his head spinning. He turned to Uma, seeing her slumped in her seat. "Uma?" he called, his voice hoarse. "Uma, are you all right?" She stirred, raising her head slowly. I think so. Are we alive?" Mark unbuckled his restraints, wincing at the pain that shot through his body. He made his way to Uma, helping her out of her seat. "Yeah, we made it, but we're not out of the woods yet." As if to emphasize his point, a nearby console exploded in a shower of sparks. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, and the temperature on the bridge began to rise noticeably. "The ship's systems are failing," Uma said, her voice imbued with urgency. "Life support won't last long in these conditions." Mark nodded, his mind already racing to formulate a plan. "We need to get everyone out. There could be crew trapped all over the ship." Uma's eyes widened. "The scientists! They were helping us near the secondary bridge entrance. We have to find them." As they made their way off the bridge, the full extent of the damage became clear. Corridors were blocked by fallen debris, and the ship's internal gravity was fluctuating wildly. They moved carefully, calling out for survivors and listening for responses. They found the first group of trapped Voth near the galley. Mark and Uma worked together, using their combined strength to shift a fallen bulkhead. As the Voth emerged, coughing and disoriented, Mark was struck by the lack of hostility in their eyes. The crash had changed everything. "We need to get to the secondary bridge entrance," Uma told the rescued Voth. "There are scientists trapped there with vital information." One of the Voth, his scales a deep green, stepped forward. "I know a shortcut through the maintenance tunnels. Follow me." As they navigated the ship's damaged interior, Mark couldn't help but marvel at how quickly alliances were shifting. Voth, who had been enemies mere hours ago, were now working alongside him and Uma to save lives. They reached the secondary bridge entrance to find it partially collapsed. The young Voth scientists were huddled behind a fallen beam, clutching data pads to their chests. "We're here to help," Mark called out, already assessing the best way to clear the debris. "Are any of you injured?" The lead scientist, her pale blue scales now covered in dust, shook her head. "We're unharmed, but we can't move this beam. Please, hurry. We have crucial data that could change everything." Mark and Uma exchanged a glance, understanding the weight of her words. They redoubled their efforts, working with the other Voth to clear a path. As they worked, the ship groaned around them, a stark reminder of their precarious situation. Just as they freed the last scientist, a new alarm blared through the ship's speakers. Uma's face paled as she translated the Voth message. "It's a countdown," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's activated the antimatter bomb." Mark's blood ran cold. He knew there was only one person who could have authorized such a drastic measure. "Zorn," he growled. Uma nodded, her expression grim. "If that bomb goes off, it'll vaporize everything for miles. We have to stop it." As they prepared to face this new threat, the sound of approaching helicopters filtered through the ship's breached hull. Earth's military had arrived, adding yet another complication to their already dire situation. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He looked at Uma, seeing the same persistence reflected in her eyes. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the fate of both their species hung in the balance. With a nod to each other, they set off deeper into the ship's bowels, ready to confront Prince Zorn and stop the countdown before it was too late. Oh, late. The clock was ticking, and they knew every second counted. Mark and Uma raced through the twisted corridors of the crashed Voth ship, their footsteps echoing off the warped metal walls. The heat from the Mojave Desert seeped through the breached hull, turning the interior into a sweltering maze. Sweat beaded on Mark's forehead as he ducked under a fallen beam, Uma close behind. "This way," Uma called, pointing to a narrow gap between two collapsed bulkheads. They squeezed through, the jagged edges of torn metal scraping against their skin. As they rounded a corner, they stumbled upon a group of injured Voth crew members, huddled in a small alcove. One of them, a young female with pale green scales, clutched her arm to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Mark hesitated for a split second, glancing at Uma. She nodded, understanding passing between them without words. Despite the urgency of their mission, they couldn't ignore those in need. "We're here to help," Mark said, approaching the injured Voth slowly. "Can you move?" The injured female nodded weakly. Yes, but Krell's leg is trapped." Uma moved to assist a male Voth, whose lower body was pinned beneath a fallen console. Together, Mark and Uma managed to lift the heavy equipment just enough for the Voth to pull himself free. "Thank you," Krell said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "But why? We're enemies, aren't we?" Uma helped him to his feet, her expression softening. "Not anymore. We're all in this together now." As they worked to free the rest of the trapped Voth, Mark explained the situation rapidly. The news of Prince Zorn's actions spread quickly among the crew, and Mark could see the last vestiges of loyalty to the royal regime crumbling in their eyes. "We need to get to the secure holding area," Mark said as they finished treating the most severe injuries. "Prince Zorn is trying to activate an antimatter bomb." One of the Voth, an older male with battle-scarred scales, stepped forward. "I know a shortcut through the maintenance shafts. I can guide you there." Mark nodded gratefully. "Lead the way." As they navigated the treacherous path, weaving through narrow crawl spaces and climbing over piles of debris, Uma's mind raced. "Mark," she whispered, "even if we stop the bomb, what then? Our people are still on the brink of war." Before Mark could respond, they emerged into a wider corridor. The secure holding area was just ahead, its reinforced doors hanging askew from the impact of the crash. Inside, they found Prince Zorn and Captain Vex, hunched over a complex control panel. The antimatter bomb sat on a nearby pedestal, its sleek surface pulsing with an ominous blue light. "Stop!" Mark shouted, charging into the room. Prince Zorn's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing with hatred. "You're too late, human. Your planet's doom is sealed." Mark didn't waste time with words. He launched himself at Captain Vex, using his Navy SEAL training to counter the Voth's superior strength. They grappled fiercely, trading blows as they crashed into consoles and equipment. Uma faced off against Prince Zorn, her newly honed combat skills on full display. She ducked under a wild swing from the enraged royal, using her agility to stay just out of reach while looking for an opening. The room became a chaotic blur of motion. Mark managed to land a solid hit on Captain Vex's jaw, sending the Voth officer staggering back. Taking advantage of the moment, he lunged for the control panel. His fingers flew over the alien interface, inputting the partial deactivation code he had memorized during their frantic journey through the ship. The bomb's pulsing light slowed, but didn't stop completely. "Uma!" Mark called out, his voice strained. "We need Voth royal authorization to shut it down." Uma redoubled her efforts against Prince Zorn, driving him back with a flurry of strikes. She managed to pin him against the wall, her forearm pressed against his throat. "Listen to me," she hissed, her face inches from his. "If you do this, you doom your own people. The Voth will die out without Earth's resources. Is that what you want? To be remembered as the prince who destroyed his entire species?" Prince Zorn's eyes widened, the weight of her words sinking in. For a moment he seemed to deflate, the madness draining from his features. I only wanted to save our people," he whispered. Uma's grip loosened slightly. "Then help us save them now. Deactivate the bomb." With a shuddering breath, Prince Zorn nodded. Uma released him, and he stumbled to the control panel. With trembling hands, he input the final code. The bomb's light faded, and a wave of relief washed over the room. But it was short-lived. Alarms began blaring throughout the ship, their urgent wail cutting through the momentary calm. The overhead lights flickered ominously. "What's happening?" Mark demanded, turning to Captain Vex. The Voth officer's face was grim. "The power core. It's destabilizing. If it breaches, the explosion will be just as devastating as the antimatter bomb." Mark's mind raced, assessing their options. "We need to eject it, now." He turned to Uma, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. Together, they moved to the engineering controls, their movements perfectly synchronized as they began the complex process of overriding the ejection systems. As they worked, Mark couldn't help but marvel at how seamlessly they functioned as a team, human and Voth, working in harmony to save both their species. It was a powerful symbol of what could be achieved through cooperation. The ship groaned around them, the sound of twisting metal a constant reminder of the precarious situation. Time was running out, and the fate of two worlds hung in the balance. Mark and Uma's hands flew over the controls, racing against the clock to jettison the unstable power core before it was too late. The future of human-Voth relations, and perhaps the survival of both species, depended on their success in these crucial moments. The ship lurched violently, throwing them off balance. Mark's fingers danced across the control panel, initiating the ejection sequence. "Brace yourselves!" he shouted as the ship shuddered. With a deafening roar, the unstable power core shot out of the vessel, arcing high into the desert sky. Seconds later, a blinding flash illuminated the horizon, followed by a shockwave that rocked the crashed ship. As the dust settled, an eerie silence fell over the area. Mark helped Uma to her feet, both of them breathing heavily. They exchanged a look of relief, the gravity of what they'd just accomplished sinking in. "We did it," Uma said softly, her scales shimmering in the dim emergency lighting. Before Mark could respond, the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. Earth's military had arrived. They made their way out of the ship, emerging into the harsh Mojave sunlight. A group of human soldiers approached cautiously, weapons raised. Behind them, a line of military vehicles stretched across the desert. Mark stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Stand down," he called out. "We're not a threat." General Chen emerged from one of the vehicles, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the scene. "Captain Anders, report," she ordered. Mark took a deep breath and began to explain the situation. As he spoke, Uma translated his words for the Voth crew members who had gathered behind them. The tension in the air was palpable as both sides eyed each other warily. "Swire," and that's when we ejected the power core, Mark concluded. "General, I know this is a lot to take in, but we have a unique opportunity here. The Voth aren't our enemies anymore. We've been working together, and I believe we can find a peaceful solution." General Chen's expression remained impassive as she processed the information. After a moment, she turned to Uma. "And you? What do you have to say about all this?" Uma stepped forward, her posture straight and dignified. "General, my people came here out of desperation, not malice. We've made mistakes, but we've also seen the potential for cooperation. The young scientists we rescued have made a breakthrough that could change everything." As if on cue, Dr. Elijah Stern approached, flanked by the Voth scientists they had saved earlier. He carried a data pad, his eyes bright with excitement. "General Chen, you need to see this," he said, handing her the device. The general's eyes widened as she scanned the information. "Is this accurate?" she asked, looking up at Dr. Stern. He nodded enthusiastically. "It's preliminary, but the data is solid. A combination of carefully selected human and Voth genetic material could potentially solve their crisis without resorting to forced breeding or subjugation." A murmur of excitement rippled through both the human and Voth groups. Mark watched as the implications of this revelation sank in. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. General Chen was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving from Mark to Uma, then to the gathered Voth crew. Finally, she lowered her hand, signaling her troops to stand down. "This situation is unprecedented," she said, her voice carrying across the desert. "But I believe we have an opportunity here that we can't ignore. Captain Anders, Miss Uma, I want you both present for the negotiations that will follow." Mark nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned to Uma, seeing the same mixture of relief and anticipation in her eyes. As the two groups began to mingle cautiously, Mark noticed Captain Vex approaching. The Voth officer's usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by a look of weariness and, was that remorse? "I wish to speak with your leaders," Vex said, his voice low. I have made grave errors in judgment. Perhaps by sharing what I know, I can begin to make amends." Mark exchanged a glance with Uma, then nodded. "I'll take you to General Chen," he said. As they made their way across the crash site, Mark couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things were changing. Human soldiers and Voth crew members were already working together to treat the injured and secure the area. The sound of shared laughter drifted across the desert air, a stark contrast to the tension of just hours before. Dr. Stern had gathered a group of human and Voth scientists around him, gesticulating excitedly as he explained his findings. The young Voth scientists listened intently, their eyes bright with curiosity and hope. Uma touched Mark's arm, drawing his attention. "Look," she said softly, pointing to the horizon. In the distance, a convoy of vehicles was approaching. Mark recognized the logos of various scientific institutions and government agencies. Word had spread quickly, and the world was responding. As they watched the approaching vehicles, Mark felt Uma's hand slip into his. He turned to her, struck once again by the depth of emotion in her alien eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark squeezed her hand, feeling the smooth texture of her scales against his skin. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The sun began to set over the Mojave Desert, casting long shadows across the crash site. As darkness fell, the area came alive with activity. Floodlights flickered to life, illuminating the massive form of the Voth ship. Human and Voth alike moved with purpose, the seeds of cooperation already taking root. Mark and Uma stood at the heart of it all, their unlikely partnership a symbol of the change that was to come. As they prepared to join the negotiations that would shape the future of both their species, they knew that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.